a millionaire rescued an abandoned boy from the highway and brought him home. One day when he arrived early, he was shocked to discover that the boy was calling the police to arrest him. Jacob, a 13-year-old boy, jolted awake in the dead of night. The silence was thick and stifling, pressing against him in a way that made the air feel almost unbreathable. He shifted restlessly in his bed, the pale moonlight filtering through the window, seeming to follow his every move, as if it too was searching for something lost. His eyes were unfocused, struggling to adjust as sleep still clung to him, blurring his vision. Yet, an unsettling feeling of dread crept over him, urging him to get up. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He took a few cautious steps down the hallway, which felt darker and more empty than usual. The chill he felt was deep inside him, fueling a sense of anxiety that made his skin prickle. As he neared his father's room, he noticed the door slightly ajar. The faint light from the hallway cast a glow on the bed where his father should have been lying, but something was off. Jacob stepped inside, and the scene in front of him made his heart freeze. His father lay on the floor, unmoving, his eyes vacant, and his skin as pale and cold as stone. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, with an undeniable presence of death that Jacob could barely comprehend. Trembling, he moved closer, his legs weak beneath him. Reaching out, he touched his father's shoulder, and a chill ran down his spine. He shook him, his voice a shaky whisper. "Dad, Dad, wake up." But there was no answer. His father was gone. Jacob's heart pounded as panic set in, his mind spinning as he tried, desperately, to find a sign of life, a breath, a pulse, any spark of hope that his father might come back to him. But all he felt was a crushing weight of sorrow. Kneeling beside him, tears began to spill down his cheeks, his voice cracking in a desperate plea that came not from a need for answers, but from a deep, aching sorrow. "No, Dad, please. It can't be." Just then, the door creaked open, and a familiar voice called his name. "Jacob, are you all right?" Peter's voice cut through the silence as he rushed into the room, stopping in shock when he took in the scene. There lay Jacob's father, motionless on the floor. The bewilderment in Peter's face shifted to something darker as he let the bottle of liquor in his hand drop, shattering against the hardwood. "Oh my God! What happened here, Jacob?" Peter asked, his tone thick with suspicion. Jacob shook his head, dazed. I don't know. I just woke up and found him like this. I tried to wake him up, I did." But Peter took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You did this, didn't you?" His voice was louder now, accusing in a way that made Jacob's stomach twist. Jacob stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding. "No, I didn't. I swear. I woke up, and he was just gone. I don't know what happened." Peter's face hardened, his eyes showing a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Don't lie to me, Jacob. Everyone knows you had issues with him. You two were always at each other's throats. You can drop the act." "No. No," Jacob whispered, his words breaking as he tried to find his balance. "It wasn't like that. I didn't do anything." He reached out, hoping for a shred of understanding, but Peter only let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Everyone's going to know, Jacob," Peter said, his tone cold. "Everyone knew you were in a rough place, that the arguments never stopped. And now he's dead, and you're here, acting all innocent." He shook his head. "No one's going to believe you. You're done." Frozen in place, Jacob felt his world collapse. Jacob's voice faltered, his mind overwhelmed by a chaotic storm of emotions. Anger, fear, shame, sadness, all crashing together. He looked to Peter, the friend he'd always trusted, but what he saw in Peter's eyes was a cold mirror of the turmoil raging within him. A deep ache settled in Jacob's chest, The pain of betrayal from someone he had trusted implicitly. "Peter, please." Jacob's voice was a faint, pleading whisper. "You can't do this. I didn't do anything, I'm innocent." But Peter was already stepping away, his gaze lingering on Jacob one last time, before turning to leave. "I'm going to tell everyone, Jacob. You can't hide anymore." Those words sank into Jacob's heart like venom, shaking him to his core. He could feel his life unraveling, and he was powerless to stop it. He was being accused of something he hadn't done. His father was gone, and now the blame was being heaped upon him in a way so brutal he could barely hold himself together. Less than an hour later, the ambulance had come and gone with his father. Jacob left home, each step carrying him further from the nightmare that the street had become. The blazing sun beat down on him, scorching his skin, but even that was nothing compared to the burning stares of people around him. He felt every glance like a dagger, cutting deeper and deeper, as if branding him with a word he couldn't shake. Monster. He moved toward the edge of the square, trying to escape, but a group of people blocked his path, closing in around him. His body screamed to flee, but his legs felt like lead, his breathing coming in shallow gasps. Desperation clawed at him from within. A woman, weary-looking yet scornful, approached, her expression twisted in contempt. She sneered, eyebrows raised. "You have the nerve to show your face here? After what you did to your own father? Criminal?" She stepped back, lifting her hand as if to shoo him away. "Get out of here. I can't even stand to look at you." Jacob tried to swallow the pain swelling in his throat, but it was too much. Before he could respond, a middle-aged man in a worn-out jacket stepped forward, smirking. "What's wrong, kid? You gonna run and hide now like the coward you are?" he mocked. "Attack your own father and still have the nerve to show your face on this street?" He laughed, as if he'd delivered some grand punchline, then shoved Jacob aside without an ounce of pity, not even worth a second look. The crowd laughed cruelly, and Jacob could see that they took pleasure in his suffering. Every mocking laugh felt like a dagger to his heart, an unrelenting assault on his spirit. Out of nowhere, a young man, who had been watching silently from a distance, stepped forward with a bucket in hand. Jacob noticed the movement, but before he could react, it was too late. The icy water cascaded over his head, soaking his hair, drenching his clothes, and chilling him to the bone. He gasped at the sudden cold, but the true sting wasn't the physical shock. It was the ridicule, the jeers and laughter of the crowd that cut him deeper than any wound. "This is what you deserve, you monster!" the young man sneered, his voice filled with disdain. The crowd roared with approval, their laughter swelling. The freezing water didn't just leave him shivering. It magnified the unbearable shame already suffocating him. The words rang in his ears, pounding relentlessly. "You should have been buried with him. The world would be better off without scum like you." Jacob's chest constricted as his face burned with humiliation. He longed to shout, to defend himself, but his voice failed him. The agony inside was so overwhelming that it felt like he was suffocating. Each breath carried the acrid taste of failure, his lungs barely able to draw in air. The taunts and laughter circled him like vultures, closing in, trapping him in a whirlwind of despair. Before he could gather himself, another figure emerged from the crowd, a heavy-set man reeking of alcohol, stumbling toward him with a sneer. Without hesitation, the man threw the contents of a greasy, foul-smelling bucket onto Jacob. Food scraps and rancid grease clung to him, sliding down his face and body. It was a disgusting spectacle, a cruel joke for the crowd's amusement. "This is where you belong. In the trash," the man spat, his words slicing through Jacob's last shreds of dignity. A woman's shrill voice cut through the noise. "No one wants you here. You killed your own father, and you dare to show your face." Her eyes blazed with hatred, her words venomous. The emotional torment outweighed any physical discomfort Jacob could endure. He stood frozen, his body unable to move under the crushing weight of humiliation. The scorn in their eyes was a silent verdict, a condemnation that left him utterly alone. His legs felt weak, his body drained of strength, his mind spinning in a haze of despair. Jacob couldn't fight back. He could only endure, drowning in the suffocating tide of shame. He didn't know where he could go or what he should do, but the hunger in his stomach overshadowed everything else. He stumbled down the road, his weary steps leading him toward a small diner. Just the hope of getting a bite to eat was enough to keep him going, though he knew he couldn't last much longer without food. Hesitantly, he walked in, his eyes scanning the room for a hint of kindness. The place was bustling. Tables were packed with patrons chatting and laughing, blissfully unaware of his desperation. As he approached the counter, the waiter looked him over with a smirk. "What do you want, kid?" he asked bluntly, not even giving Jacob a chance to speak. "This isn't a place for beggars." Before Jacob could reply, he forced down the sting of humiliation and managed in a shaky voice, "Please, just a little food. I'm very hungry." The waiter eyed him as if he were something unpleasant, then sneered, turning to a nearby table. "Look, folks, we've got ourselves a little monster begging for scraps here. What do you think? Should we feed him?" One of the customers, a smug-looking middle-aged man, raised his brows. "Feed him? He belongs in jail if you ask me," he said with a sneer. "But hey, why not do a good deed?" Suddenly, a woman at the next table grabbed a piece of meat from her plate and flung it at Jacob. The meat struck his face before falling to the grimy floor. She laughed coldly. "There you go, monster. It's probably the best you'll get." For a moment, the room fell silent, then burst into mocking laughter. The woman scoffed. "He should get used to eating off the floor. That's where he belongs anyway, isn't it?" The waiter, ignoring the shame clouding Jacob's face, walked around loudly calling, "Anyone else want to throw a little something his way? Let's do a good deed, folks. It's not every day we get to help out a little criminal." Then chaos took over. People began grabbing anything within reach, pies, bread slices, even cups of soda, and threw them at Jacob. Each piece seemed like a punishment, each laugh a blow to his dignity. "Eat up, monster." A man with a sweaty t-shirt sneered, "Nothing like a good lunch, right? How about some soup of shame?" An older woman chimed in, mocking as she tossed a cup of lukewarm soup straight at Jacob's face. He tried to pull away, but the crowd closed in, blocking any escape. His eyes stung, filling with unshed tears. Yet he couldn't let himself cry. Each movement seemed to make things worse. When he glanced over at the waiter, silently pleading for help, the man just shrugged, turning away as though Jacob's suffering was invisible. "Get lost. Go back to where you belong, monster," another woman jeered from a table across the room. A man approached and dumped a glass of beer over Jacob's hair, as if it were some tasteless joke. Jacob stood frozen, feeling less like a person and more like an animal on display for ridicule. His face was smeared with food, his spirit crushed. His eyes burned, not from tears, but from the sensation that he was slipping further and further away from his own humanity. He tried to back out of the scene, but someone shoved him, knocking him to the ground. "Don't think you can just walk away, monster. You'll pay for what you did. Pay with your life," said the man who pushed him, grinning maliciously. Jacob struggled to get up, weighed down by shame and humiliation. His hair and face were soaked in drink and remnants of food. He wished he could vanish, but there was no escape. The laughter around him felt like daggers, tearing at his heart. His pain reduced to a twisted form of entertainment. As his body shook, he wondered how much longer he could bear this. A group of stumbling, drunken men ambled over, their laughter loud and grating, the heavy scent of alcohol thick in the air. "Well, "Look who it is," one of them slurred, a crooked smile on his face. "The city's infamous monster. You really did it, didn't you? Killed your own dad?" They laughed, and though it was just taunting, the question sliced through Jacob like a knife. He tried to back away, but they were too close, laughing uproariously, as if it were all some twisted joke. "Come on, monster, tell us the story. How'd you do it?" Another drunk sneered, leaning in close as Jacob was cornered, pinned against the wall with nowhere to go. With a gleeful look, the man took his beer and tossed it in Jacob's face, adding to the mess and the humiliation. "Here, something to drink. Maybe it'll calm you down," one of the men sneered, tossing the drink in Jacob's face. Jacob, soaked, tried to wipe his face on his shirt sleeve, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. Not just from the liquid, but from the sharp ache of being humiliated like this. "I didn't do anything. I didn't kill my father," he murmured, his voice cracking under the weight of despair. The group only laughed harder. "Oh, of course you didn't, monster. Just another sad soul hiding behind a story," one taunted, leaning close and giving him a weak push, enough to send Jacob stumbling backward. He fell to his knees, feeling the sting of pain shoot through his hands and knees as they hit the ground. Another poured more alcohol over his head, adding to his shame. "Get out of here before we get sick of you." Jacob tried to stand, but a heavy sense of being treated like dirt kept him grounded. It felt as if the weight of everyone's scorn was pressing down on him. He could feel the tears start to well up, but he fought them back, unwilling to show even more vulnerability. Yet their voices continued to echo in his mind, each word sharper than the last. "You're not wanted here," spat one of the men, his tone thick with disgust. "You're a monster. You'll always be a monster." In a final, degrading act, one of them nudged Jacob's leg with his foot, sending him further off balance. "Leave before we decide to have more fun with you." Jacob tried to get up again, but his legs were shaky, his body drained, and his spirit shattered. He could barely see through his tears, but all he wanted was to escape, to find somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't here. "I just need to go," he whispered to himself. "I need help." But his quiet plea was met with more jeers. "Help? Nobody's going to help someone like you," one laughed, as they turned and walked away, their voices fading into the night. Alone now, Jacob lay on the cold ground, his clothes filthy, his body aching, his spirit nearly broken. Crawling toward the edge of the street, he felt the full weight of his solitude. There was no one around to stand by him, no one to pull him up, and in that moment, he almost believed them, believed that he was the monster they claimed he was. He felt like a stranger to himself, lost in who he was and who he might become. Closing his eyes, he tried to block out the ache, the humiliation, and their harsh words. His stomach twisted, not just with hunger, but with the agony of it all. Flashes of what people accused him of, rather than what he'd actually done, kept playing in his mind. Worst of all, he was starting to doubt himself. Jacob stood there, frozen as disbelief washed over him. Fear and despair gripped him so tightly that he struggled to even comprehend what was happening. The ache in his chest deepened, with every harsh word thrown his way. "I didn't do anything. I didn't kill my father," he murmured softly, almost as if pleading for someone to believe him. Shame and guilt tightened around his throat like a noose, making it difficult to breathe. The accusing glances from people around him and their piercing words that cut through him like knives made him feel smaller and more culpable, as if their scorn was more painful than any physical wound he could suffer. Without waiting for another word or any offer of help, something he was sure wouldn't come, Jacob rose unsteadily, his body weakened and drained. He couldn't stay there a second longer. He had to leave this place where the weight of blame and contempt threatened to crush him with each passing moment. Slowly, he began to walk, each step more challenging than the last, with tears still streaming down his face. It felt like every step was fighting against gravity, as if the ground itself was pulling away from him. But he couldn't shake the fear gnawing at him, making him look over his shoulder, terrified that the crowd around him would close in at any moment, pressing down with an unbearable force. The city's noise, the jeers, the buzzing conversations seemed to rise against him, as though every attempt to move toward freedom was met with more humiliation and disdain. Fear ruled his body, and without thinking, he started to run, the words of condemnation echoing louder in his mind with every step. He wanted to block out the voices, to shut his eyes to the scornful looks. He just wanted to escape, to vanish, to flee from this endless nightmare. His heart pounded so hard that he could feel it thrumming in his ears, each step feeling final, each breath an enormous effort. The heat of the day caused sweat to roll down his face, but the urgency, like something dark was following him, pushed him to run even faster. The sounds of cars passing nearby grew louder, as if their engines and honks were keeping up with his frantic pace. He avoided looking at the cars and avoided meeting the eyes of anyone around. But the approaching noise forced him to glance to the side, terrorizing him with each glimpse. He heard the loud blare of a car horn, and his eyes caught sight of the vehicle racing toward him. His body froze with fear, his legs twitching but locked in place. The engine roared, speeding up as it came closer, and he could feel the real danger of being hit. Every part of him was gripped by terror, his gaze glued to the car, convinced he couldn't avoid it. As the car drew nearer, he saw the headlights reflecting off the pavement, the blinding sunlight bouncing off them. He tried to force his legs to move faster, but they felt like lead. He braced himself, knowing that impact was seconds away. Then, just as he expected the collision, the car came to a sudden screeching halt, mere inches from him. The sharp smell of burnt rubber filled the air, and the sound of the tires skidding still rang in his ears. "Hey, are you out of your mind? Trying to get yourself killed?" the driver yelled angrily through the open window, his face flushed with frustration rather than worry. For a moment, Jacob stood there, unable to respond, his heart pounding wildly from the close call. The driver continued to yell, hurling curses, but Jacob could only stare back, numb and speechless, trapped in a feeling of helplessness. He didn't want to die, but he also had no idea how to escape the suffocating guilt, shame, and despair weighing him down. With one last insult, the driver sped away, leaving Jacob standing there, his body tense, his breath shaky. He felt as though the ground were shifting beneath him. He was lost, unsure of where to go or how to bear the blame for something he hadn't done. With every ounce of strength left in him, he staggered off the street, his gaze fixed on the sidewalk ahead. His body was drained, and his mind felt distant, desperate for an escape from the aching that consumed him. He felt like he couldn't go on, like he wanted to vanish, to hide from everything and everyone. Yet more than anything, he felt the sharp sting of loneliness, the shame and the heavy weight of being seen as the monster everyone believed he was. Panic coursed through him faster than he could move. Sweat dripped down his brow, his feet burning against the sun-scorched pavement as he wandered aimlessly, each step barely fueled by a single thought. Home. Home. The one place he imagined might still offer him a glimmer of refuge. But the closer he got, the heavier the weight of judgment, accusations, and harsh stares bore down on him. His feet ached from the searing ground. He wanted to stop, to give in to the pain, but something kept pushing him forward. He knew that if he stopped, the nightmare would consume him entirely. Shame would become his only companion, maybe forever. So he kept running, each step a desperate attempt to reclaim some piece of normal life in the midst of chaos. "I didn't do anything," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. almost as if the accusations had taken root within him. He couldn't escape the feeling that others saw him as someone he was not. "I didn't kill my father," he repeated, but the voices in his mind drowned out his own words. His confidence crumbled. What remained of his dignity seemed to burn away as he pushed himself through the dirty, chaotic streets. His goal was close now. Home, his sanctuary, the place he'd always trusted to shield him from the world's cruelty. But as he neared his street, something felt wrong. He slowed, a primal instinct urging him to be cautious. Rounding the corner, he froze at the sight that awaited him. His house was engulfed in flames. The fire raged, devouring the walls, the windows, the roof, everything he had ever known, all at once. Thick smoke curled into the sky, the harsh sound of cracking wood echoing in his ears as if his heart itself were burning, alongside what little was left of his life. He stood there, every inch of him trembling, his gaze locked on the inferno. "No, no!" He tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat, strangled by grief and terror. He stumbled toward the door, but his path was blocked by neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk, watching silently. They did nothing. They all just stood there, as if watching a show. "You going to burn too, boy?" A sneering voice cut through the crowd, and Jacob turned to see who it was. It was the man from the convenience store he'd visited earlier, the one who'd cursed him and branded him a monster. There he was, his face twisted in a cruel grin as he watched the devastation unfold. He looked pleased, almost satisfied, as if Jacob losing everything was exactly what he'd hoped for. "This is what you deserve," the man spat, his gaze laced with disdain. "Never forget, you're the monster. Your father's death is on you, and this is just the start." The words sliced through Jacob, sharper than any physical wound. He felt an urge to scream, to run headlong into the blaze and end it all. But he was frozen, trapped in helplessness, as he watched his home, the last piece of his life, vanish into ash, unable to stop any of it. Jacob rushed toward the funeral procession gathering in the crowded streets. People stood around the cemetery, some with faces twisted in disgust, others expressionless, but they all shared a common belief, that Jacob was responsible for his own father's death. The weight of their hatred pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, as he moved closer to the service. Fixing his gaze on the coffin, he struggled to make sense of it all. His father, the only person he'd loved and respected, was gone, buried before his eyes. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow the monster in everyone's story. "I didn't do anything," he whispered, but the words felt hollow, like no one was left to believe him. As he approached the crowd, whispers spread. He could feel their contempt like a knife, twisting with every stare, each muttered word hitting harder than the last. "There he is, the monster," muttered a man, pointing at Jacob with a hard, accusing look. "Who else would do this to his own father?" a woman sneered, and heads around her nodded, as if it were undeniable. Just when he tried to move closer to the coffin, a firm hand blocked him. It was one of the neighbors, a tall, burly man who shoved him back with force, making him stumble, barely catching himself from falling. "You're not welcome here, you wretch," the man spat with a sneer. "Your very presence dishonors your father's memory. You don't belong." Jacob stumbled from the shove, his mind spinning, but he tried to gather himself. His voice trembled as he pleaded, his words heavy with desperation. "I didn't do anything. I didn't hurt him. He was all I had." His eyes darted around, searching the faces in the crowd for even a flicker of understanding, hoping someone would see his pain and believe him. "I swear it's not true," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of their stares. But his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd began to chuckle, some mockingly, others with outright disdain. as if his attempts to defend himself were nothing more than a pathetic joke. "Look at him," an older woman with a tight scowl said, addressing those nearby. "He can't even lie convincingly. Just like his father, a rotten apple doesn't fall far from the tree." Each word struck Jacob like a blow, chipping away at him until he felt smaller and more powerless. He turned his gaze back to the casket, his heart heavy, as if it carried the blame they heaped on him. Their whispers and taunts bore down on him, suffocating any shred of hope he had left. It was as if the guilt for his father's death was being forcefully placed on his shoulders. Jacob wanted to scream, to shout his truth, but the words dissolved before they left his lips. "You need to leave, Jacob," a sharp voice broke through the chaos. It was a woman from the neighborhood known for her judgmental glances and cold remarks. She stared at him with a piercing glare. "We all know what you did," she accused. "There's no point in denying it." Jacob's throat tightened, and though he longed to refute her claims, his voice failed him. The words he so desperately wanted to say felt trapped, buried beneath the crushing weight of shame and grief. He tried once more, his voice hoarse from crying. "Please, I just want to say goodbye. Let me stay. Just for a moment." His plea was met with nothing but disgust. People began stepping back as though his presence contaminated the air around them. When he moved closer, the woman shoved him again, harder this time, nearly sending him to the ground. "Leave!" she snapped. "You don't deserve to be here. You have no right to say goodbye to him. Leave, or I'll call the cops on you too." Jacob's legs felt like they might give out beneath him. He wanted to stay, to show that he was there with a shattered heart and that he wasn't the villain everyone painted him to be. But the words rang in his head, sharper each time. Every insult, every accusation, every scornful glance. He didn't belong here. He didn't deserve to stand near the father he loved so much. His eyes brimmed with tears as he looked at the coffin one final time, trying to sear the image into his memory, then turned and walked away, head hanging low. The crowd didn't let up. Their jeers and taunts followed him like shadows, as if his departure was their triumph. "Get lost, you criminal," someone yelled, their voice laced with cruelty, punctuated by mocking laughter. "Don't you dare show your face here again." Jacob's shoulders sagged under the weight of their words. He left the cemetery beaten, not just physically, but in every way a person could be broken. He had no fight left in him. The world's judgment had crushed him yet again. As he wandered through the streets, moving farther from the graveyard, hot tears rolled down his cheeks. His gaze was empty, his direction aimless. He had no home left, no purpose left, nothing. All that remained was the ache, raw, relentless. The ache of being blamed for a crime he didn't commit. The ache of being labeled a monster, treated as something less than human. Deep down, a single truth pierced him. He might never find a place where he was truly welcome again, where he could simply be Jacob. He walked down a lonely stretch of road, tears dripping freely. His body shook, not just from the chill of the wind, but from the despair that gnawed at every corner of his soul. He didn't know where to go. He didn't know how to move forward. His life had crumbled piece by piece, and there was no rebuilding it. Everything was gone. His father, the man who had always been his source of strength, his sense of safety. And now, Jacob carried the unbearable weight of being accused of taking that life. People looked at him as if he'd committed the ultimate betrayal, as if he had deliberately destroyed the one person who had truly cared for him. It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. He didn't wish for anyone's death. All he wanted was for things to go back to the way they were. But that was impossible now. The icy road beneath his feet felt as unforgiving as the world around him, each step grinding him deeper into despair. The wind bit at his face, relentless. almost as if it were the only thing left that acknowledged his existence. The headlights of passing cars flickered like distant reminders of a world that didn't care. The road stretched on, infinite and unyielding, and Jacob was left with no answers, no destination. He didn't know where to go, or if he could ever find his way back. Jacob was utterly alone. His body throbbed with pain, his mind teetered on the edge of collapse, but the most crushing blow came from the knowledge that he had lost everything. No home, no family, not a single friend to lean on. The world seemed to close in around him, and all he could feel was the overwhelming weight of loneliness and rejection. Just as he was drowning in despair, the faint hum of an approaching car broke through his thoughts. At first, he assumed it was just another vehicle like so many others, zipping past without a second glance. But this time was different. As he turned his head, a sleek black car slowed down, coming to a stop right next to him. The vehicle was refined, its windows tinted so dark that it was impossible to see who sat inside. Its elegance stood in stark contrast to Jacob's hopelessness. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a deep, calm voice. "Are you okay, son?" Jacob froze, his breath hitching. His tear-streaked face turned toward the sound, expecting yet another indifferent stranger. But as his swollen eyes focused, he noticed a man with a face that bore the signs of experience and age. The stranger wore a finely tailored black suit, his presence commanding, but not overbearing. "I'm lost," Jacob stammered, his voice cracking. Tears spilled over once more. "Nobody believes me. I didn't do anything. I'm not a monster." The man's steady gaze rested on Jacob. His eyes were soft but piercing, as if he could see right into the boy's soul. For a moment, the air between them was heavy with silence. Jacob felt raw, exposed, like his very essence was laid bare. And yet, there was something about this man's voice, his very presence, that made Jacob feel a flicker of safety he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. "I know what happened, Jacob," the man said, his tone low but resolute. "My name is Henry. I've heard about what happened to your father, and I know you had nothing to do with it." Jacob blinked, stunned, his mind struggling to process the words. You believe me?" he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Henry nodded, his expression unwavering. There was something in his eyes, a quiet conviction, as though he could see what no one else could. "Yes," he said simply. "I believe you. I'm not the kind of person who makes judgments without understanding the full story. I can see the pain you're carrying, and I know you're not what they say you are." Those few words, so simple, yet deeply meaningful, struck Jacob like a soothing balm on an open wound. For the first time in what felt like forever, a flicker of hope sparked within him. Everyone else had turned their backs, but this man seemed to peer past the accusations and see something more. Henry gave a faint smile, his hand motioning gently, inviting Jacob closer. "You don't have to stay out here alone. Let me help you. Come with me to my home. There you can rest and heal without fear of being judged." Jacob was stunned. He stared at Henry, unsure how to respond. He had never imagined anyone would extend kindness to him, especially when all he'd known was rejection and scorn. The ache in his chest was still there, but for the first time in ages, he felt the faintest sense of relief. "Wait, you'd really take me to your home?" Jacob asked, his voice shaky, struggling to grasp whether this was reality or some cruel illusion. "I don't know what to do anymore. I've lost everything. I'm completely alone." Henry's expression softened even further, and his voice carried a warmth that Jacob hadn't heard in years. "You're not alone anymore. Come on, I'll take care of you." Without a second thought, Jacob climbed into Henry's car. For the first time in days, he felt as though there might be a sliver of light piercing the darkness of his life. As the car rumbled down the empty road, carrying them toward Henry's grand estate, Jacob couldn't help but wonder, was he truly free from the weight of suspicion? Or was this act of generosity simply a fleeting moment before the world's harsh judgment descended on him once more? As the car sped along the dimly lit highway, Jacob closed his eyes. He felt the heavy burden of his past lingering, but also for the first time, a glimmer of relief. Someone had seen him as more than the world's accusations, as a person worth helping, worth saving. Even though he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, this small act of kindness planted the seed of something new, the belief that beyond the shadows, there might still be a chance for light. Henry's estate was a haven of opulence and tranquility, yet to Jacob, it felt like stepping into an entirely different reality. The walls were adorned with intricate tapestries and masterpieces by celebrated artists, and the air carried a faint blend of polished wood and incense. It stood in stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving streets he had come from, but even here, he found it difficult to fully let his guard down. His gaze darted around the room, restless, noting every movement and detail with suspicion. Henry, on the other hand, moved through the space effortlessly, exuding an air of natural command over his surroundings. Dressed sharply in a dark suit, he walked with a purposeful stride, often straightening his tie with a swift motion, as though the gesture was about more than just his appearance. With a fluid movement, Henry frequently ran his hand through the back of his hair, a subtle reminder of his self-assured demeanor. Even in the comfort of his home, where he appeared slightly more at ease, there was an undeniable sense of control in everything he did. Jacob took in every nuance, torn between intrigue and hesitation. When Henry entered the living room, Jacob was already seated. The older man removed his jacket with practiced ease, draping it over the sofa with the care one might give a cherished possession. Jacob couldn't help but notice the meticulous way Henry adjusted his tie or wiped his hands on his pants before touching anything, even something as mundane as a coffee cup. Henry's actions, marked by precision and deliberation, fascinated Jacob, though he couldn't quite grasp the reasoning behind them. "You seem on edge," Henry remarked, his voice calm and deliberate as he settled into the sofa opposite Jacob. His words carried a measured quality, as though he chose each one with care. "Relax, there's nothing to fear here." Jacob tried to summon a smile, but failed. He sat stiffly, feeling like an intruder in a space far removed from his own world. His eyes lingered on Henry, noticing the millionaire's peculiar habits. Each time Henry took a sip of his drink, his fingers performed a subtle adjustment, as if fine-tuning something imperceptible on the glass. It was a small but deliberate gesture, one that seemed instinctual yet exact. Jacob, inexplicably drawn to the motion, felt an urge to mimic it. He glanced at the glass of water in front of him, hesitated, and then clumsily imitated Henry's movement, his fingers grazing the glass in a way that mirrored the older man, albeit with far less grace. He hadn't noticed that he was mirroring the man's movements until Henry's voice interrupted his thoughts. "That's not going to help you feel any more at ease, Jacob," Henry remarked with a light chuckle, his tone amused as if he caught onto the boy's awkward attempt to fit in. Rising smoothly from the couch, Henry's every motion carried a polished elegance that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. One hand moved along the back of his suit, brushing an invisible wrinkle, his gestures precise and meticulous. "You don't need to try and adapt to me or mimic what I do," Henry added, walking toward the massive window that framed the mansion's sprawling view. His movements were seamless, exuding a quiet confidence, as though he controlled not just his steps, but the air around him. He turned to Jacob, his gaze calm, yet unwavering. "Take your time to figure yourself out. There's no need to rush." Jacob remained silent, his eyes fixed on Henry, trying to grasp everything that was unfolding before him. However, he couldn't help but be enamored with the man's mannerisms, including the way he subtly adjusted his shirt cuffs, the ease with which he ran a hand through his hair, and the air of contemplation he exuded while staring out the window. It would be great if we knew which country the people listening to this story are from. Don't hesitate to share the name of your country below in the comments section. There will definitely be many compatriots there. Now, let's move on to the next part of the story. Something about Henry's demeanor struck a chord in Jacob. He couldn't explain why, but he found himself wanting to emulate it. The poise, the assurance, the control. It felt like Henry's every movement held a secret Jacob was desperate to unlock, though its meaning eluded him. The next day, the mansion felt colder than ever. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the expansive windows, casting a pale glow on the marble walls, as though the light was attempting to pierce the calculated stillness of the place. The silence was almost oppressive until the metallic creak of the gate broke it. Henry stepped through the front door, his exhaustion evident, though his suit remained flawless, his stride deliberate. Yet something unsettled lingered in his expression, a tension he couldn't quite shake. He wandered through the house with a measured pace, the familiarity of his surroundings offering little comfort. When he reached the living room, he stopped abruptly. Jacob stood there, but something about him was different. He no longer seemed like the uncertain, lost boy from the night before. Instead, he was trying to mimic Henry's every move, as though he was attempting to inhabit the millionaire's persona. But it didn't feel right. Jacob's head tilted slightly, his posture rigid, as if he had absorbed Henry's gestures, but failed to master their fluidity. He fidgeted with his tie and pushed his hand through his hair in an awkward parody of Henry's confidence. While his efforts were eerily close, they felt stiff and disjointed, lacking the effortless grace he sought to replicate. Henry studied him for a long moment, discomfort creeping into his chest. There was something unnerving in watching his own movements reflected back at him, twisted into something unnatural. "What exactly are you doing?" Henry's voice was sharper than he intended, the edge in his tone betraying his attempt to stay composed. A knot of unease tightened in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite shake. It felt like Jacob was encroaching on his life in ways he couldn't control, and the thought unsettled him. This wasn't just idle curiosity. The mimicry Jacob displayed wasn't innocent. It was unsettling, as though the boy was trying to become someone else, someone he could never truly embody. Jacob froze under Henry's scrutiny, his body rigid like a deer caught in headlights. His wide eyes glistened with a strange mix of defiance and shame. He tried to brush off the moment, but Henry's intense gaze left him feeling exposed, stripped of the thin veil he'd been hiding behind. Instinct had driven Jacob to imitate Henry's posture, a subconscious effort to anchor himself in something steady, something safe. But now that Henry's icy demeanor was present, the flimsy illusion broke. I just wanted to see how it felt," Jacob mumbled, the words tumbling out hesitantly, his voice faltering. His eyes dropped to the floor, weighed down by an inexplicable sense of guilt. It wasn't just about copying Henry. There was something deeper, something even he didn't fully understand. The tension in the air was thick. Henry took a step closer, his piercing eyes locked onto Jacob. Normally unflappable, he now felt an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest, a mix of irritation and something else he couldn't quite place. Jacob's attempt to mimic him felt invasive, even unnerving, like the boy was trying to claim something that wasn't his to take. "That's not how it works, Jacob," Henry said, his voice quieter, but no less stern. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to keep control. "You can't just look at someone else and decide to borrow their pieces to make yourself whole. That's not how you figure out who you are." Jacob dared to glance up, but stayed silent, his shame hanging thick in the room. The words stung, not because they were unkind, but because they hit a truth he wasn't ready to face. The emptiness he felt inside was vast, and Henry's confidence seemed like a lifeline he couldn't reach. For just a moment, he wanted to feel grounded, to feel like someone who wasn't adrift in a sea of uncertainty. But every attempt to grasp at that feeling only pulled him further away from himself. He wanted to be strong, to stand tall, but with each passing moment, he felt more lost. Henry's gaze lingered, studying him as though trying to decipher the thoughts swirling in the boy's mind. There was no denying the discomfort between them, but there was also something else, a faint trace of understanding. He could see the hesitation in the boy's expression, but there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface, something heavier. Jacob wasn't just mimicking someone else. He was hiding behind it, as if trying to construct a personality that wasn't truly his own. It unsettled Henry, stirring a strange mix of discomfort and guilt within him. Why was he reacting this way? His role was to guide Jacob, not to feel threatened by him. "I've given you a roof over your head. I've given you a chance," he thought, trying to suppress his frustration. "You can't just use me as a shield, Jacob," Henry said, his tone firm and edged with intensity. He stepped toward the window, resting his hand on the cold pane of glass, his thoughts racing. "You need to figure out who you are. No one can teach you that. It's not about copying someone else." He turned back to Jacob, his voice growing more resolute. "That's not how life works. It won't protect you." The weight of Henry's words pressed down on Jacob, leaving him silent. His throat tightened as confusion washed over him. He hadn't meant to lean on Henry in that way, but somehow that's exactly what he'd done. Worse still, he realized he didn't know who he was anymore. Without Henry's commanding presence, without this idea of power and confidence, he felt hollow. "I just wanted to feel strong," Jacob finally murmured, his voice cracking under the strain of his emotions. "Like you." The words fell out as a fragile confession, almost a plea for understanding. But deep down, he wasn't only asking for strength, he was begging for a sense of self, for something that would make him believe he had value in the world. Henry turned, his gaze locking onto Jacob's. His eyes held a mixture of emotions Jacob couldn't quite place. Sorrow, perhaps, or compassion. But there was something more, something unspoken. Slowly, Henry stepped closer, studying the boy as if trying to unravel the layers of his struggle. "I see what you're trying to do," Henry said, his voice softening. "But there's one thing you need to understand. Mimicking someone else won't give you what you're searching for. And just because something feels right doesn't mean it's the answer." Henry's voice dropped slightly, weighted with meaning. "I'm not your answer, Jacob. You have to find that on your own." The words lingered in the room, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Jacob's chest tightened, his fear and uncertainty building until they threatened to overwhelm him. He had no idea what to do with the truth that had just been laid bare. He wasn't sure if he wanted to follow Henry's path or forge a completely different one. All Jacob knew was that he felt adrift, and Henry's words weren't helping to clarify anything. Henry paused, casting one last look over his shoulder before leaving. "Find your own way, Jacob," he said, his tone calm but heavy with meaning. "Remember, copying someone doesn't make you stronger. It only weakens you." The door clicked softly as it closed, leaving Jacob alone in the suffocating silence of his thoughts. Deep down, he knew Henry's words held truth, but they didn't make his choices any clearer. An unsettling realization crept into his heart. He didn't know who he truly was. Meanwhile, Henry entered the mansion feeling drained, yet something strange began to gnaw at him. Passing through the living room, he froze at the sight before him. Jacob stood in front of a tall mirror, wearing Henry's coat, his movements eerily mirroring Henry's every gesture. From adjusting his tie to smoothing his hair, Jacob's imitation was disturbingly precise. Henry observed for a few moments, his unease growing, before finally breaking the tension with a sharp, commanding tone. "What are you doing?" Jacob stopped mid-motion, startled, and turned slowly to face him, his expression distant and unreadable. He wasn't just copying mannerisms, he was trying to embody someone else entirely. "I was trying to be you," Jacob admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know how to be myself." Visibly uncomfortable, Henry stepped closer, his voice more demanding now. "Why are you copying everything I do? What's going on?" Jacob's blank stare lingered on Henry before he finally responded, his words chilling in their clarity. "Because you killed my father." The accusation landed like a thunderclap. Henry stood frozen, struggling to comprehend what he'd just heard. His voice, now strained, broke the silence. "What are you saying?" "That You took his life," Jacob said with an eerie calmness. "And I see his eyes every time I look at you." The weight of Jacob's words pressed down on Henry like an anchor. "I don't know what to think anymore," Jacob continued. "You're the only person I can trust, and that's why I'm trying to become you." Henry, shaken to his core, stumbled back. The accusation was suffocating, twisting reality and pain into something almost unrecognizable. Yet, in Jacob's eyes, there was a sincerity that left Henry unnerved, a truth he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. "I didn't do it, Jacob," Henry said, working hard to keep control over the situation. "You're mixing everything up. I'm not the person you think I am." But Jacob, eyes distant and unfocused, wasn't listening anymore. The tension between them grew, a heavy accusation lingering in the air like a dark, unspoken threat. Silence took over, with Henry struggling to make sense of it all. He stood still, watching Jacob, a blend of disbelief and unease on his face. Jacob, still wrapped in the millionaire's coat, held his gaze steady, as though he were seeing something invisible to everyone else. The luxurious room seemed to shrink, pressing in on Henry with the weight of Jacob's unspoken judgment. "Jacob, you're wrong," Henry managed, his voice shaking as he attempted to stay composed. Yet Jacob's eyes remained fixed, silently accusing. "I never even met your father, let alone harmed him. Why would you believe that?" But Jacob's stare didn't waver. His face showed a shadow of pain, tinged with something deeper, almost like resentment. He pulled the coat around himself as though seeking protection. "Because you remind me of him," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Of the man who came to our house just days before my father died. I never saw his face, but I remember his movements. The way he adjusted his tie, the way he pushed up his sleeves and gestured. Those same gestures. I'll never forget them." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Jacob's eyes, piercing and unwavering, left him frozen. "My father owed him money," Jacob continued, his voice trembling as though he were living through the memory all over again. "I heard him pleading, saying he just needed more time. He had a family, a son to care for." Jacob's tone grew sharp. "But the man didn't care. He said he wouldn't wait any longer, and he left." Henry took a deep breath, but couldn't tear his gaze away from Jacob's sorrow-filled expression. "After that, my father was terrified," Jacob said, his voice caught between anger and pain. "He was always looking over his shoulder, barely sleeping, haunted. And then one night, he was just gone. And now, here you are." With the same expressions, the same mannerisms. "You welcome me, bring me into your home, and treat me kindly. Why?" Henry took a step back, holding his posture. But there was something in Jacob's tone that cut through him. The boy was hurt, fractured, and seemed desperate to get answers, even if it meant pressing him. "Jacob," Henry murmured, attempting a comforting tone. I don't know what to say. I'm not who you think I am. I'm not the man responsible for this." "Then why do you act like him? Why do you look so much like him? The way you straighten your coat, the way you speak. It's like I'm seeing him all over again." "There's no point hiding it," Jacob said, his voice rising with accusation and pain. "You know what happened." Henry wiped his forehead, feeling a cold sweat. The tension was building, nearly unbearable. He could see the hurt etched into Jacob's face. The kid was close to breaking, lost in his world of doubt and anguish. "Jacob, I truly don't know what to tell you. I brought you here because I could see how much you were struggling and how much you needed someone to reach out. I just wanted to offer a little kindness," Henry said, hoping to find a glimmer of understanding in Jacob's eyes. I'm not your enemy," he added. But Jacob shook his head, a deeper look of mistrust settling in his gaze. "You just want to get rid of me, just like they got rid of my dad. I know you're involved somehow. I can feel it. I'm not crazy." Those words hung between them, the silence thick and nearly suffocating. Henry swallowed, feeling the weight of Jacob's suspicions pressing down on him. Jacob was clearly broken, but his words carried an eerie certainty, as if spoken by someone who had nothing left to lose but his own beliefs. "You're safe here, Jacob. I promise. I only want to help," Henry mumbled, but even to his own ears, his words felt hollow. Jacob's gaze stayed fixed on him, as if searching beyond the surface, looking for whatever truth Henry might be hiding. Suspicion lingered between them, like a shadow neither could escape. In the days that followed, tension simmered throughout Henry's mansion. Jacob kept his distance from the millionaire, yet he couldn't resist watching him closely whenever they shared a room. His eyes tracked Henry's every move, each glance heavy with suspicion, and with each passing day, the sense of unease seemed to intensify. Henry could feel the weight of Jacob's gaze, noticing how the boy's demeanor grew more guarded, as if he were perpetually on alert, scrutinizing every detail about him. During breakfast, Henry often sensed Jacob studying him, observing his smallest gestures. Jacob sat across from him, pushing food around his plate, his silence almost unsettling as he fixed his gaze on Henry. Trying to break the tension, Henry would ask, "Did you sleep well, Jacob?" Jacob would barely respond, offering a half-hearted yes before looking away, his expression unreadable. And each morning, the mistrust only deepened, especially when Jacob saw Henry adjusting his suit or smoothing the cuffs of his jacket in front of a mirror. It was as if these simple actions became a riddle Jacob felt compelled to solve, watching intently, as though piecing together a hidden truth. Whenever he caught Henry's eye, he'd pause for a moment, then quickly leave the room, leaving Henry with an unsettling feeling that something unspoken lay behind Jacob's guarded stares. And the nights brought no reprieve. At times, Henry felt Jacob's presence nearby in the dimly lit hallways, a shadow following his movements. On one of these nights, he heard quiet footsteps just outside his door. He opened it abruptly, only to catch sight of Jacob standing in the distance, frozen and watching. Their eyes met briefly, Jacob's expression intense, before he turned and slipped away down the dark corridor. These encounters repeated themselves, and Henry couldn't shake the sense of being a player in some obscure and troubling game. Jacob's demeanor grew colder, his expressions increasingly closed off, each word carrying an unspoken accusation. Whenever Henry tried to confront him, Jacob's responses were vague and evasive, leaving Henry feeling more anxious than reassured. It was as though a storm was quietly brewing. Its presence felt, but was not yet fully realized. The house, once a sanctuary of warmth, now felt like a fortress of unease, wrapping them in an unrelenting atmosphere of suspicion. Each movement between them resembled a cautious play in an elaborate game, where every gesture was scrutinized, every word tinged with tension, too thick to dismiss. Henry found himself wondering if bringing Jacob here had been a mistake. Sleepless nights left him pondering whether the boy's quiet wariness held a kernel of truth. Every subtle action seemed to carry immense significance. Every glance, a silent indictment. An unspoken unease loomed over them, growing more palpable with each passing moment, as though it was an unseen force pulling them further apart. By morning, the strained dynamic had reached its breaking point. Jacob, as always, remained wordless, avoiding direct interaction, though his silent presence weighed heavily on Henry, chipping away at his composure. As the day progressed, the mansion became stifling, with an invisible, oppressive tension filling its grand spaces. Then, the sudden chime of the doorbell shattered the uneasy stillness. Henry frowned, moving toward the door with a sense of foreboding. When he opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces somber. "Good afternoon, Mr. Henry," one said, his voice firm and authoritative. "We're with the local police department. We need to speak with the boy staying here. He has to come with us to answer questions about his father." Henry stared at them, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand. What's this about? What do you want with him?" he asked, his voice steady but underpinned with rising concern. His pulse quickened as one officer responded curtly, "He's part of an ongoing investigation into his father's death. We need his statement immediately." The officer's tone left no room for argument. Jacob, who had been listening from the edge of the room, slowly rose to his feet. His face was pale, as if he were stepping into the shadow of a nightmare he couldn't escape. After a moment of hesitation, he moved toward the door, where the officers waited. Henry felt the urge to step in to demand an explanation, but one of the officers cut him off with a sharp look. "Sir, it's better he comes with us. He may have crucial information, and we need his cooperation. Otherwise, we'll have to take more serious measures." The quiet weight of the officer's words made Henry pause, stepping aside, unsure of how to proceed. Jacob, stoic but visibly shaken, crossed the threshold as the officers led him away. The tension in the room lingered long after the door closed behind them. Henry hesitated, his voice faltering as he tried to explain. "I take care of him," he said, unsure of how to put into words the bond forming between him and Jacob. There was a connection, but it was tangled with uncertainty and questions he couldn't yet answer. "He's coming with us now," the police officer stated firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. In an instant, Jacob was escorted away. As the door shut, Henry stood motionless, a sharp unease gripping his chest. Something was off, deeply off, and the answers seemed just out of reach. Restlessness followed him as he moved through the house, a growing sense that he was on the verge of uncovering something he wasn't ready to face. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob's presence and his own past were inexplicably intertwined, though the connection remained obscured. Determined to find clarity, Henry made his way to the office. He began rifling through drawers with increasing urgency until his hand paused on a faded black and white photograph. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, staring at the image. It was a much younger version of himself, standing beside an older man, his father. Both shared the same piercing gaze, their expressions serious and distant, a haunting mirror of each other. The undeniable resemblance sent a chill through Henry. A knot formed in his stomach as a thought began to surface, one he couldn't ignore. Grabbing his phone, he quickly dialed his father's number, his heart pounding with anticipation. The line rang endlessly before a voice finally answered. "Hello, son," his father greeted. Relief washed over Henry, though it was mixed with unease. "Dad," Henry began, trying to steady his tone. "I'm looking after a boy. He lost his father, and his story. It's stirring something I can't explain. He's caught up in some investigation, and I need answers. Do you remember anyone connected to this boy?" There was silence on the other end of the line, heavy and deliberate. Then his father spoke, his voice tense. "I don't know what you're talking about, son. You shouldn't get involved. Leave this to the police." Before Henry could respond, the call abruptly disconnected, leaving the sound of a busy signal in his ear. Startled, he tried dialing, but the line was dead. A wave of dread swept over him. Something was undeniably wrong. Something felt off. Henry studied the photo again. His father's face mirrored his own, yet there was a chasm of distance between them. A creeping unease settled in his chest. What was going on? Why couldn't he piece it all together? It felt like he was teetering on the edge of discovering something monumental, a truth that could unravel everything he believed about himself. The tension gnawed at him with every passing moment. He needed clarity. There was something he had to uncover, something tying Jacob's struggles to the strange connections cropping up everywhere. Yet all he had now was an overwhelming sense that he was caught in a labyrinth of deception and enigmas he couldn't untangle. Needing space to think, Henry stepped out that morning, desperate for a moment of quiet, after nights filled with Jacob's turmoil and relentless, unanswered questions. He strolled down the sidewalk, lost in thought, until he noticed a man exiting a nearby house. The man froze when their eyes met, his expression shifting to shock before he abruptly turned and bolted down the street. Startled, but curious, Henry's instincts kicked in. Quickly, he took off after the man, their footsteps echoing on the otherwise silent street. He caught up with him at the corner, breathless. "Hey, why'd you take off like that?" Henry demanded. The man spun around, eyes wide with fear, staring at Henry as though he'd seen a ghost. I'm sorry," the man stammered, his gaze darting away. "I thought you were someone else." "Someone else? Someone who looks like me?" Henry pressed, his curiosity piqued by the man's nervous demeanor. The stranger hesitated, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Yeah, you look exactly like an older man I used to know. He's dangerous." The man's voice dropped, and his eyes scanned the street as if expecting trouble to appear out of nowhere. "I owe him money," he admitted, his voice tight with anxiety. A cold knot formed in Henry's stomach. "What kind of man are we talking about? What happens to people who owe him?" The man gave a strained, humorless laugh. "He collects, with interest, and if someone doesn't pay, people disappear." His voice broke as he added, "I'm trying to come up with the money, but I know he won't let me off easy." Henry's jaw tightened. "Do you know where he is?" The man shook his head quickly, panic flashing in his eyes. "No, but one thing's certain. He doesn't stop until he gets what he wants. I've seen what happens to those who cross him." The fear etched into the man's face told Henry everything he needed to know. Whoever this figure was, he left devastation in his wake. And somehow, Henry was connected to him. Before Henry could press for more answers, the man abruptly walked away, his relief at ending the exchange evident. But his cryptic words lingered, stirring a growing unease within Henry, a gnawing sense that his family's troubled history was far closer than he'd ever anticipated. As Henry made his way back home, the conversation haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. Each step toward the mansion felt heavier due to an unexplainable sense of dread. Something was off. Deeply, undeniably off. The air around the house carried an unsettling stillness that Henry couldn't quite place but felt creeping closer. When he stepped inside, a chill prickled down his spine. The silence in the house was unnerving. Moving cautiously down the hallway, he caught the faint sound of a voice coming from the living room. It was Jacob. The boy sat slumped on the couch, his head bowed, his posture weighed down by an almost visible heaviness. Typically expressionless, Jacob now looked tense, his face clouded by a dark, oppressive energy. When Henry entered, Jacob slowly lifted his gaze, and something in those eyes sent an icy jolt through Henry's core. "Are you okay?" Henry asked, softening his tone to keep it steady. Jacob exhaled shakily before answering, his voice strained. "I told the police," he muttered, his eyes hollow with despair. "Told them what?" Henry asked, his stomach knotting. Jacob lifted his head slightly, his voice more resolute now. "I said it was you, that you killed my father." Henry's breath caught, and his heart pounded like a drum. "You—" "What?" he stammered, disbelief washing over him. "I told them," Jacob repeated, his tone stronger, yet more pained. "I don't know how it happened, but the way you act, the things you say, I see it. You're like him. You're like the man who killed my dad." The words struck like a thunderclap, echoing through the room and igniting a storm inside Henry. His chest tightened as the weight of the accusation hit him. He stepped toward Jacob, frustration and confusion written all over his face. "You think I— What? You think I killed your father?" His voice quivered with restrained anger as he tried to regain composure. "You're wrong, Jacob. I'm not that man. I don't know what you think you saw, but it wasn't me." But Jacob didn't back down. His desperation only grew, his conviction unshaken. "I told the police, but they didn't believe me," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "They laughed at me, said I was imagining things, but I know it was you." The raw pain in Jacob's voice was undeniable, a mix of grief and certainty that made Henry's head spin. "I saw how you acted, how you spoke. Everything about you mirrored him, the same habits, the same words. I saw you in that man's house, and you were just like him." Jacob's voice cut through Henry like a blade, leaving him drowning in a sea of confusion and fear. The boy's conviction in his accusation was unnerving, shaking Henry to his core. "No, Jacob, you've got it wrong," he stammered, his voice unsteady. I didn't kill your father. That wasn't me." Jacob's eyes stayed locked on him, analyzing, searching for a trace of truth in his denial. "You can deny it, all you want," Jacob said quietly, his tone almost trembling. "But I know what I saw. You were there with him. And now I can't keep pretending it doesn't mean something." The weight of Jacob's words pressed on Henry's chest, suffocating him. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the gnawing sensation that something larger, something hidden and sinister was surfacing, a truth he wasn't ready to face. The thought of Jacob believing he was responsible for his father's death was unbearable. Stepping back, Henry tried to steady his breathing to untangle his racing thoughts, but the fear was creeping in, tightening its grip. Jacob's version of events started to form a picture Henry couldn't bear to look at, one that made too much sense in all the wrong ways. Jacob's unwavering gaze bore into him, and Henry felt paralyzed, unsure of his next move. "I didn't kill your father," Henry said at last, his tone steady but shadowed with unease. "Whatever you think you saw, it wasn't me. I had nothing to do with it. I was only trying to help." Jacob shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said bitterly. "The police didn't listen to me. No one did." Henry felt a pang in his chest as Jacob's words hit him, stirring something deep within. He wanted to convince Jacob of his innocence, but beneath the boy's accusations, Henry sensed that the truth, whatever it was unraveling faster than he could control. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve were falling into place, pulling him toward a revelation he feared. And the worst part, it felt like the truth didn't even matter anymore. The lie Jacob believed had taken on a life of its own, eclipsing anything Henry could say. The silence between them was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness to an unspoken truth neither of them could escape. Without another word, Henry turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jacob behind. His mind raced as the pressure mounted, the unanswered questions suffocating him. Somehow, he would have to confront this. But how do you explain the unexplainable? The past was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be reckoned with, and Henry knew it wouldn't rest until it had its day. The tightness in his chest felt unbearable, his mind churning with a volatile mix of confusion, frustration, and unease. He needed clarity, an explanation for the cryptic message Jacob had delivered. What was the boy trying to convey, and how did it tie into something far larger than anything Henry had ever fathomed? He strode down the hallway toward his office, a sleek and meticulously arranged space. Usually a place of control and order, it now felt stifling, echoing the heavy atmosphere that seemed to envelop the entire mansion. The muted glow of the office lamps cast shadows over the polished wood furniture and rows of books and files. Yet tonight, those details barely registered in Henry's mind. A sense of urgency pressed on him, as though he were teetering on the edge of a revelation he wasn't ready to face. He headed straight for his grand mahogany desk, where crucial documents were stored, and began yanking open drawers with hurried, almost frantic movements. Business reports, contracts, and financial records were scattered throughout the drawers. But then, something unusual caught his eye. A small, weathered wooden box pushed to the back, seemingly forgotten. It was distinctly older than anything else in the office, its tarnished lock suggesting it hadn't been touched in years. An inexplicable pull urged him to investigate. With a deep breath, Henry pulled a key from his pocket, fitting it into the rusted lock. The box creaked open, revealing a collection of yellow papers and faded photographs. As he shuffled through them, his pulse quickened when his gaze landed on a particular stack of black and white photos. The images were of a man, someone who bore a striking resemblance to his father, but was much younger. The man was posed with others, their expressions severe and foreboding. Henry flipped one of the photos over, hoping for an explanation, but the back was blank. The faces stared back at him, unsettlingly familiar, yet veiled in a mystery he couldn't grasp. His trembling hands retrieved more papers from the box, documents filled with notes and detailed financial records. As he scanned the words, an ominous pattern began to emerge. The records pointed to high-value monetary exchanges, accompanied by cryptic terms: payment, collection, settlement. But what struck him most was a name that appeared repeatedly: Wayne. His brow furrowed as he read the name over and over, the weight of its significance pressing down on him. Henry dug deeper into the box, his curiosity quickly turning into alarm as he unearthed something even more troubling: a document bearing his father's name. The pages were filled with ominous details: debts, obligations, and what appeared to be a thinly veiled threat. The final line, scrawled in hurried, nearly illegible handwriting, read, "The debt must be paid in full before the final installment is due." Despite the messy script, the message was unmistakable. Henry's heart pounded as the chilling realization began to take shape. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but the image they formed was something far darker than he had ever anticipated. What kind of trouble had his father been in? What secrets had been buried in his family's past? Desperate for answers, Henry shuffled through more papers, uncovering records of shady transactions. One in particular caught his eye, a ledger referring to account settlements with staggering sums of money and a date eerily close to the death of Jacob's father. Henry swallowed hard, the air in the room growing heavy. It was impossible to ignore the connections. Whoever his father had been dealing with wasn't just dangerous. They were directly linked to the tragedy that had changed Jacob's life forever. Pacing the room, Henry felt his mind racing uncontrollably. It was like pulling a loose thread on an old sweater, only to watch the entire fabric of his past unravel before his eyes. The realization was suffocating. His family's wealth, the businesses, the contracts he once considered respectable, all of it now reeked of corruption and blood. The name Wayne resurfaced in his mind, a shadowy figure connected to his father's illicit dealings. It was all tied together, the dirty money, the mounting debts, and the mysterious death of Jacob's father. The horror of it hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time, Henry felt utterly helpless. The discoveries weighed on him like a crushing force, dragging him into a pit of despair. This wasn't just about him anymore. The danger extended to everyone he cared about. And Jacob, the boy he had tried so hard to shield, now seemed to hold the key to the entire mystery. But instead of protecting him, all Henry had done was push him away, too terrified to face the truth head-on. Henry's heart pounded as he stared at the scattered papers in front of him. A relentless need to uncover the truth consumed him. Answers about Wayne, the mysterious figure tied to his father's past, unresolved debts, and even the tragic death of Jacob's father. His eyes combed through the documents until they landed on a discovery that sent a shiver down his spine. A phone number. It was scrawled hastily in messy handwriting on an aged piece of paper. Henry's fingers trembled as he reached for his cell phone and dialed. His pulse quickened with each ring, a weight settling in his chest as the sound reverberated through his mind. He knew that whoever answered on the other end could hold the key to truths that would change everything. After what felt like an eternity, the call connected. A raspy, weary voice answered. "Hello?" Henry froze momentarily, words caught in his throat. His thoughts raced in a chaotic loop, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. Still, he knew he couldn't back down. "Hi," Henry began hesitantly. I'm looking for Wayne. I found something and need to speak with you." There was a brief, tense silence, only broken by the sound of labored breathing on the other end. Then the voice responded, slow and deliberate. "Wayne? Yeah, that's me." The tone was sharp, almost mocking, making Henry's stomach churn. "The old man, Bradley, he still hasn't paid up, has he?" Wayne continued, his words sending a chill through Henry. "He knows what's at stake, and he owes a lot. I was just thinking today that it's time to settle things." Henry's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles whitening. A wave of dread swept over him. Settle things. What are you talking about? What are you planning to do to him? Wayne's voice dropped an octave, taking on a steely edge. "I'll do what's necessary. He's had his chances, and now it's time to make sure those accounts are balanced. He'll understand what happens when debts aren't paid. No one escapes that." Henry's blood ran cold as his mind raced to piece together Wayne's ominous words. "Who are you talking about? What do you mean by settling?" The response was chilling, deliberate, and without remorse. "He thinks he can just carry on, living comfortably, pretending none of it matters. But the price always comes due. And you, Mr. Raymond, should know this. Nobody gets away with it. Not him, not you, nobody." Henry's breath caught, the weight of Wayne's words sinking in. This wasn't just about the past. It was about something far darker looming on the horizon. Henry froze, completely astounded by the conversation taking place in front of him. The truth he had long suspected was now being laid bare. Yet the man's chilling words made him question if he was losing his grip on reality. "Are you telling me you're going to kill him? Are you saying you're planning to poison him?" Henry's voice trembled, disbelief dripping from every word. A low, carefree chuckle followed a brief period of silence on the line, as if for the man on the other end. This was just another day. "Yes, sir. Quick and clean. I've waited long enough." His tone darkened. "He's going to pay for what he's done. Today's the day." Henry felt like the ground beneath him was giving way. His chest tightened as dread coursed through him. He needed to act, but panic seized his thoughts. How had it come to this? How could such a horrifying plot be brewing in his own home with the very person he trusted most, his father, embroiled in a web of deceit, debts, and crimes? "Don't do it!" Henry shouted desperately into the phone, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "I had no idea about any of this. Please, don't do it." The line went dead. For a moment, Henry stood frozen, the phone slipping from his grasp. His body shook, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just heard. It felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. But it was real. His father, the man he had always looked up to, was complicit in something unimaginably vile. And now, the person Henry thought he could rely on was about to become the embodiment of betrayal. Grabbing his car keys with trembling hands, Henry bolted out the door. He couldn't wait another second. He had to find his father. He had to stop Wayne before it was too late. But as he drove, the weight of helplessness bore down on him. How could he possibly save a man who had already sunk so deep into his own lies? The sound of Wayne's voice replayed over and over in Henry's head, every word cutting him like a dagger. When Henry arrived at Raymond's office, he entered with heavy, deliberate steps. His expression was a storm of anger and despair, and in his hands, he clutched a folder packed with damning documents and photos, evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the past few days. He was ready to confront the man he once called his father. The opulence of the office, with its polished wood furniture and lavish decor, only heightened Henry's disgust. It was a perfect mirror of Raymond himself, outwardly impressive, but concealing a soul tangled in lies, manipulations, and crimes. The facade of success was as hollow as the trust Henry had once placed in him. Raymond sat at his desk, cradling a glass of whiskey in one hand, his focus fixed on a contract before him. He didn't lift his eyes when Henry stormed in, though the tension in the room instantly thickened. The sound of the door slamming shut reverberated like a gunshot. "Dad," Henry began, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with simmering resentment. "You need to see this." He hurled a folder onto the desk, the sharp sound of it hitting the glass, breaking the heavy silence. Raymond finally raised his head, locking eyes with Henry in a moment of unspoken conflict. The younger man's anger was palpable, his restraint hanging by a thread. "You're going to look at it, aren't you?" Henry demanded, his voice trembling under the weight of his fury. "You're going to face the truth because I'm done with your lies, Dad. I'm done pretending to be okay with the mask you hide behind." Raymond, who had remained stoic until then, furrowed his brow slightly, his composure showing the faintest crack. Slowly, he set his glass aside and looked at the folder. But instead of diving into its contents, he met Henry's gaze with an unsettling calm, his voice low and almost soothing. "You're overreacting, Henry. I know things have been hard for you lately, but this isn't necessary. Everything I've done was for you, to give you a life of ease, to make you someone who matters." "Oh, is that so?" Henry retorted, his voice cutting through like a blade. "Tell me, Dad, how exactly does that work? How did you build this life? This empire of deceit and manipulation? You've always kept your secrets, but not anymore. I know everything now, every last bit of it." He jabbed a finger at the folder, documents spilling out onto the desk. Raymond picked it up with an eerie calm, leafing through the pages. The silence between them grew oppressive, the air heavy with unspoken words. As Raymond scanned each page, his face remained unreadable. "I knew this day would come," Raymond finally said, still looking at the papers. His voice was quiet, almost resigned. "I always knew you'd find out." "You knew?" Henry's voice cracked, a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You knew Wayne murdered Jacob's father over a loan he needed just to buy food for his family. And you just let it happen? You let it happen, and then you covered it up. You protected him because you owe him. And now you have the audacity to act like this doesn't matter?" The words hung in the air, cutting through the silence like shards of glass. "And now? You think you're going to sway me with the same tired arguments?" Raymond finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Henry. The coldness in that look sent a shiver through Henry. "I did what was necessary. I loaned the money, and he understood the risks. When you enter that world, you know the cost. It doesn't matter who gets hurt, as long as debts are settled. That's how it works, Henry. The real rules of the game. And no, I didn't handle the dirty work myself, but you're well aware I have my ways of making sure things get done." Henry stepped forward, fists clenched tightly. "You're not going to walk away from this. Not this time. I've seen the proof, all of it. Jacob's father, he was just another one of your victims, a casualty in your schemes. You've used your wealth and influence to destroy lives, taking a man's life as easily as flicking a switch. And now you think you can keep lying to me." Raymond shook his head, already looking exasperated. Slowly he stood, his expression showing the kind of tired annoyance one might have toward a child throwing a tantrum. "Henry," Raymond said, rubbing his forehead as if the conversation drained him, "do you really think I haven't thought this through? That I don't know exactly what I've done? I'm a businessman. I didn't build my fortune playing nice. I built it because I understand how this world works. It's not fair. And honestly, you should be grateful for everything I've given you." "Grateful?" Henry repeated, his laugh bitter and sharp. "Grateful for being kept in the dark. Grateful for living a lie. Grateful for unknowingly being complicit in all of this." Henry snatched up a photo from the folder on the table. A faded old picture of Raymond, much younger, standing beside a rough-looking man. The same man Henry had seen in photos with Wayne. "This man. You remember him, don't you? He was part of one of your early deals. He's dead now, and no one knows the truth. But I do. And I'm going to make sure the world knows too." Raymond's eyes flickered to the photo, his lips curling into a cold, humorless smile. He paused for a moment, then let out a low, mocking laugh. "You just don't get it, Henry. You'll never get it. I'm not going to apologize, nor will I feel sorry for what I've done. The world works this way. People do whatever they must to survive and seize power. You should have figured that out a long time ago. Now, you'll have to accept the truth. There's no turning back." Henry took a step back, a storm of frustration and fury swirling inside him. "You won't walk away from this unscathed," he spat. "I'll expose everything, every lie, every crime, every single person you and your cronies have destroyed. The world will hear the truth, and you'll face justice." Raymond stared at him, completely unfazed, his face a mask of cool indifference. He exuded the same control he always wielded. "Do you really think anyone will believe you, Henry? Do you think you stand a chance against me? Do you even comprehend who you're trying to defy?" Henry's voice trembled, but his determination didn't waver. "You'll see, Father," he said firmly, his resolve unshaken. "You'll see what I'm capable of." As Henry stormed out of his father's office, his chest tightened with a mix of defiance and despair. His heart pounded as Raymond's words echoed in his mind, each one driving a wedge deeper between them. Everything Henry once thought to be true about his father seemed to crumble with each passing second. Just as he reached the door, Raymond's cold, sharp voice cut through the room. "Henry," he said, his tone void of warmth or compassion, "go home. Collect yourself. You'll need it." Henry shot him a scathing look, but held his tongue. He was done with the arguments. Without another word, he turned and headed for the exit. But before he could leave entirely, Raymond turned his attention to someone else. "Kimberly," Raymond called out, his voice laced with irritation. From the kitchen doorway, a weary-looking woman appeared. Kimberly had the gentle demeanor of someone who worked tirelessly without complaint. She had spent years quietly keeping Raymond's house in order, cleaning and organizing with care. She bore no responsibility for the chaos that had unfolded within those walls, but Raymond didn't see her humanity. To him, she was just another cog in his machine of control. "Yes, Mr. Raymond," Kimberly replied softly, her voice trembling with practiced submission. Though fear simmered beneath the surface, she dared not let it show. "Would you mind explaining to Henry what happened to my priceless porcelain vase?" Raymond said, his tone cutting. "Were you playing with it, or was it your way of disrespecting me?" Kimberly's face went pale, her body visibly stiffening. She hesitated for a moment, bracing herself for whatever humiliation Raymond might heap upon her next. "Sir, I didn't break the vase. I swear I didn't do it." Kimberly's voice trembled as she spoke, her hands nervously clutching the hem of her apron. Raymond pushed back his chair, his movements deliberate, as if her very presence was a burden he could barely tolerate. He approached her slowly, each step radiating intimidation. His eyes bore into her, filled with contempt. "Don't lie to me, Kimberly," he sneered. "This clumsiness of yours, this inability to stay in your lane, it's exhausting. Look at yourself. You're not some naive young girl anymore. Do you even realize what a disgrace you are?" His voice turned cutting as he added, "Take a good look at your life, at your reflection. What do you see? An unattractive, insignificant woman with nothing to offer but your hands and that pathetic yellow smile." He leaned in closer, his words dripping with venom. "That's all you are, isn't it? A nobody. Someone who lives in the shadow of people like me." From across the room, Henry stood, frozen, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Fury simmered beneath the surface as he watched his father demean Kimberly, a woman who asked for nothing more than to quietly do her job. Raymond, undeterred, continued his tirade. "Do you actually think you have a chance at something better? A chance to climb out of this miserable excuse for a life?" He let out a cruel chuckle. "If you had even an ounce of pride, you'd have left long ago to find something, anything, better. But no, you stay, groveling, begging to please me." He gestured dismissively. "Don't you get it? I could replace you in a heartbeat. You're just another faceless nobody in this house, insignificant and replaceable." Kimberly's face burned with humiliation, her eyes darting to the floor. Shame weighed heavy on her, leaving her silent and powerless under Raymond's verbal assault. She fought back tears, her dignity crumbling with each of his harsh words. Henry could no longer stay silent. He stepped forward, his voice sharp with anger. "Dad, stop. That's enough." His glare met Raymond's, filled with fury and a deep sense of disappointment. "You can't keep treating people like this. You can't keep being this." Raymond turned to face his son, his expression unreadable, but for the mocking smirk tugging at his lips. "And what exactly are you planning to do about it? Do you honestly believe I care about your opinion, son? You've always been a pampered child, and now you're just an incompetent grown-up who can't handle the real world. You expect me to be compassionate. Let me tell you, there's no room for kindness here. Only the cold truth that people are disposable. You understand that, don't you? Don't forget, I hold all the power here, and I can do whatever I please with whomever I choose." Raymond then turned to Kimberly, his face twisted with disdain. "Get out of my sight. Wipe that pathetic look off your face and go back to doing what you're good at, being irrelevant to me." Without responding, Kimberly stepped back, her head bowed, and quietly left the room. The hurried sound of her retreating footsteps brought her a strange sense of relief, but Raymond's cruel words echoed painfully in her mind. Deep down, she knew that as long as she stayed in that house, she would never be seen as anything more than a mere servant. Henry, on the other hand, was shaking with anger. The scene unfolding before him felt unreal. His father had just degraded a woman who was simply there to do her job. The fury inside him built steadily, as though something within him snapped, breaking apart the already fragile image he had of Raymond. "You're a monster," Henry said, his voice tight as he struggled to stay composed. "I can't do this anymore. I won't. I'm not your son anymore." Raymond let out a cold, dismissive laugh, devoid of any trace of emotion. "Oh, really? Now I'm the monster? You've enjoyed the comforts of wealth your entire life. My heart bleeds for you, Henry. Go ahead. Do whatever you think you need to do. I have no time for your nonsense." With a final glare of disgust, Henry stormed out of the room, his stomach churning with nausea and his mind racing with turbulent emotions. This confrontation was only the beginning. He knew his father didn't care about anyone, but he could no longer stand by and watch Raymond's cruelty go unchecked. The rage and frustration within Henry weren't directed solely at his father, but at everything Raymond represented. From that moment on, Henry resolved to do whatever it took to dismantle the world of tyranny Raymond had built. As he walked back to his own quarters in the mansion, his thoughts swirled, Raymond's voice still reverberating in his mind. A searing anger coursed through him, mingled with an overwhelming need for justice. Yet, the path ahead seemed empty, filled with unanswered questions that weighed heavily on his soul. The path forward was clear, at least when it came to dealing with Raymond. Yet, as Henry approached his neighborhood, an unexplainable urge brought him to a halt. There, under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, stood Jacob. The boy was slumped against a crumbling wall, his frame frail and his clothes stained with grime. His pale, drawn face carried an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. Jacob's gaze was fixed on some faraway point, distant and hollow, as if he were waiting for something, or someone, that would never come. Alone. Again. The sight hit Henry like a punch to the gut, stirring an all-too-familiar ache. He recognized that look, the raw isolation, the invisible burden of undeserved blame. Henry's steps slowed as he approached, his voice breaking the stillness with quiet concern. "Jacob," he said gently, his tone laced with worry. "What are you doing out here? Why aren't you at home? Are you alone again?" Jacob's head lifted, revealing eyes that blazed with restrained anger and deep-seated pain. His thin shoulders drooped with exhaustion, but his expression held a fierce, unyielding resolve. "I'm not going back to the house of the man who murdered my father," Jacob said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the cold night air. There was an unmistakable tremor of sorrow beneath his words, but also a defiant edge. "I'm not going to be part of this anymore. I'm not your pawn. I'm not something you can control." The words hit Henry like a slap. He froze, his breath hitching. Jacob's accusations, laced with venom, hung heavily between them. "You're just like them," Jacob continued, his tone biting. "But now, you're the last one I can blame for his death." Henry's throat tightened, the words he wanted to say struggling to break free. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Jacob's rage to cut so deeply. And yet, beneath the sharp sting of guilt, there was something stronger, a desperate need to make things right. "No, Jacob," Henry said, his voice shaking but earnest. "You've got it wrong. I didn't know about any of it. I didn't know my father was involved in whatever happened. I don't know the full story, but I do know this. I'm not like him." His words faltered, the weight of Jacob's distrust pressing down on him. The boy let out a bitter, hollow laugh, one that twisted like a knife in Henry's chest. "You want me to believe you? After all this?" Jacob's voice cracked with disbelief, his piercing stare locking on Henry. "After everything you've done, you expect me to just trust you now? To believe you didn't know your father had a hand in this?" Henry swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. Jacob's words sliced through him, sharper than he thought possible. He felt exposed and insignificant. Every ounce of guilt he carried now sat bare in front of the boy, who had every reason to doubt him. Jacob's anger wasn't unwarranted, but it cut deeper than anything Henry had faced before. "I know I can't make up for what happened to your father, Jacob, and I know I can't erase the past, but I can't just leave you out here, struggling to survive. You shouldn't have to live on these streets, hungry and alone. You don't deserve that." Jacob stared back at Henry, his expression a storm of hurt and anger that he didn't know how to process. He didn't want to believe Henry's words, yet there was something in them that stirred a faint flicker of hope, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, his suffering might come to an end. "I don't want to trust anyone connected to all this anymore," Jacob said sharply. "I don't trust you, Henry, or anyone else. What happened to my father, it wasn't just about his death. It was about what he stood for, what he meant. He was just another victim like me, of people like you." Each word hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He couldn't deny the boy's pain or argue that his anger was misplaced. Deep down, he knew Jacob was right. Yet Henry also knew he couldn't walk away. He couldn't let Jacob spiral further into a cycle of pain and bitterness. Taking a deep breath, Henry felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. Jacob's mistrust was written all over his face, and Henry knew he had to say something, anything, that might reach him. The truth, no matter how messy or painful, had to come out. "I know you think I'm to blame, Jacob," Henry began, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "And I know it all looks like it's on me. But it's not. I'm not that man." He paused, grappling with the words, each one cutting like a blade as he forced them out. "The truth is, everything I have, all the wealth my family owns, was built by my father. He created it through sheer effort and by piling up debts and ruin along the way." Jacob's brow furrowed as he listened, his skepticism clear. But even through his distrust, curiosity flickered in his eyes. "Debts? What are you talking about?" Henry nodded grimly. "My father preyed on people's desperation. He loaned money to those who had hit rock bottom, people who had nowhere else to turn. But he wasn't generous about it, Jacob. Far from it. He charged outrageously high interest rates, rates no one could ever realistically afford. When people inevitably failed to repay, he found other ways to make them pay. And that's how it always was. This ruthless cycle of control and exploitation is what built our wealth." Henry's voice wavered, but he pushed forward, unable to hold back. "I didn't know, Jacob. Not at the beginning. I grew up surrounded by this deception, this carefully constructed illusion. I thought my father was a brilliant businessman. But now I see. I see everything he truly was." Henry lowered his gaze, his words heavy, almost choking him. "My father only cared about money. People meant nothing to him. He used them until they were drained. And when they couldn't give any more, he left them to fend for themselves. He forced them into impossible situations, into desperation. Sometimes it led to their deaths. Like what happened to your father." Jacob staggered back, the weight of Henry's revelation hitting him like a blow. His head shook slightly, his disbelief written all over his face. "You're telling me your father is responsible for my dad's death? That everything that happened to him was because of your father's schemes?" Henry froze, unsure how to respond. Was that what he was saying? Was that the truth finally surfacing? The realization settled over him like a storm cloud. With pain-filled eyes, he nodded. "Yes, Jacob. That's what I've come to understand. It's not what I wanted to believe, not what I wanted to accept, but it's the truth. And I'm guilty too, not because I caused it, but because I didn't see it sooner. I didn't recognize the devastation my father left in his wake." He hesitated, struggling to get the words out. "I didn't see how he ruined lives, one after another. How he treated people like pawns in his game. And your father was just another one of those pawns." Jacob's stomach churned as he tried to process the enormity of what he was hearing. It all felt impossible, unreal. "So, what now, Henry? What do you want from me? Do you actually think I'm going to forgive you, that I'm just going to accept this and move on? You and your father, you're the same. Nothing you say can change that." The fury and heartbreak in Jacob's voice cut deep, and Henry felt the full force of it. He knew there was no fixing this, at least not now. But he couldn't leave without saying his piece. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Jacob. I know I don't deserve it. I want you to hear the truth and understand what really happened. I can't undo my father's actions, but I can take responsibility now. I can try to make it right." Jacob stared at Henry, his face twisted with both anger and sorrow. He wanted to believe him, but every word sounded hollow, like a promise already broken. Trust felt like a distant memory, and the weight of it all was suffocating. "I don't know if I can trust you, Henry. I don't know if I can handle all of this," Jacob admitted, his voice trembling. Henry stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Jacob's. He had to make himself clear. Jacob had to understand, even if it was too late to mend the past. "You don't need to forgive me, Jacob. Not now," Henry said firmly. "But I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll do everything I can to ensure what happened to your father never happens to anyone else. I know I can't bring him back, but if you let me, I'll try to make amends." The silence that followed was suffocating, Henry's words hanging heavily in the air. Jacob felt a profound ache inside, yet mingled with it was a faint glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent. He didn't know if he could trust Henry, but he also knew he couldn't keep living in a world that felt so broken. They stood in a tense stillness, each wrestling with their own thoughts. The truth had come out, raw and unkind, yet one thing was undeniable. Their lives were now tangled together in a way neither could have anticipated. As Henry drove, the atmosphere inside the car was thick with unspoken words. The weight of their shared pain and revelations pressed down on them. Outside, the world seemed to move on, indifferent to their turmoil, until it didn't. On the streets, people began to turn their heads toward the car. Whispers turned and angry murmurs, and the mood shifted ominously. A sudden crack shattered the uneasy quiet. A rock had hit the car window, startling Henry. He slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as he scanned the crowd, now gathering around them. Jacob sank into his seat, his face pale as he watched the angry faces closing in. Their glares were sharp, their movements menacing. "It's him!" someone shouted, pointing directly at Jacob. The crowd surged closer, their hostility unmistakable. The boy who had killed his own father. Henry clenched the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes scanning the swelling crowd outside the car. His chest tightened as panic rose. Every second felt like the situation could spiral out of control. Jacob curled into himself, his face pale and his wide eyes filled with terror. "They won't believe me. They never will," he whispered, despair thick in his voice. Henry knew staying still wasn't an option. Taking a steady breath, Henry cracked the window just enough to project his voice while keeping the crowd at bay. Raising a hand to signal calm, he shouted with a mix of authority and urgency, "Please, hear me out. Jacob isn't guilty. He's as much a victim as anyone here. Let me explain." For a fleeting moment, the crowd wavered, but then a furious voice pierced the air. "Liar! You're defending him! That boy deserves no pity!" Others joined in, their shouts of anger and insults reverberating through the street. Henry felt the pressure mounting, but refused to back down. Leaning slightly closer to the window, he raised his voice above the chaos. "I know this is hard to accept, but you don't know the whole story. Jacob's pain is not the pain of guilt. He didn't do this, and I'll prove it if you let me." A hush fell over the mob for a split second, confusion ripping through as wary glances were exchanged. But skepticalness lingered. Jacob had lost his father. The person responsible for this tragedy is still out there, free. Henry continued, his voice steady but fierce. "It's not Jacob. He didn't cause this. He's suffering just like you are." His words began to resonate, some faces softening as doubt crept in. A woman near the front shook her head muttering, "What if he's telling the truth?" The angry energy in the crowd started to waver, replaced by hesitant murmurs and uncertain looks. Seizing the moment, Henry pressed on. "Please, just let us through. I promise you'll get the answers you need, but we can't give them if you don't give us this chance." Gradually, the crowd parted, leaving just enough room for the car to edge forward. Henry wasted no time, his heartbeat still pounding as he eased the vehicle ahead. Next to him, Jacob exhaled a shaky breath, his body still tense, but his expression carrying a flicker of hope. They'd made it through this trial, but both knew it wouldn't be their last. As they moved past the crowd, Henry kept his gaze firm, ready for whatever came next. He knew he had to find the right words to stop the cycle of hatred and set the record straight. "Listen," he called out, his voice firm enough to reach everyone in the crowd. "He didn't kill Jacob's father. That's a lie you've told yourselves, because it's easier to believe than the truth." He paused, drawing in a deep breath before continuing. "You all know who's really responsible for that death. My father, Raymond, built his fortune on the suffering of people like you. How many of you have borrowed money from him only to face his threats later? How many of you have been forced to follow his orders just to pay off a debt that never stopped growing? How many families here have suffered because of his ruthless collections?" The crowd began to shift. Some lowered their eyes, the weight of shame and fear settling in. "You've felt the fear, haven't you? The crushing weight of every threat he made." He looked around at the faces staring back at him. "And yet, instead of confronting the real cause of your pain, you've turned your anger on a boy who had nothing to do with it. You humiliated Jacob because he was alone, because he was an easy target. Do you even understand what it's like to lose a father? He's just a kid, abandoned, with no one to protect him." The crowd grew quieter. Some people still looked skeptical, but others softened, their expressions beginning to shift. Henry's voice grew more impassioned. "You blamed him because it was easier than facing the truth. But deep down, you know who's truly at fault." As silence spread through the gathering, the red and blue glow of police lights bathed the scene. Henry stepped forward, holding the folder of documents he'd brought, the ones he'd shown to his father the night before. Handing them to the officers, he spoke clearly and with resolve. These papers exposed everything, how Raymond's fortune had been built on exploitation, threats, and the misery of others. He laid it all bare, explaining his father's years of deceit and abuse of power. The officers reviewed the evidence without a word, while the crowd stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and reflection. It was as if a veil had been lifted, exposing the true source of Raymond's wealth. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted from anger to guilt and remorse. One woman who had been among those berating Jacob earlier stepped forward. Her face was full of regret as she reached out, placing a hand gently on Jacob's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We made a mistake." As the crowd began to close in, murmurs of apology and words of support reached the boy, who for the first time felt truly seen and forgiven. With everything cleared up, Henry and Jacob returned home, where they spent the evening together. They shared a meal and a sense of relief, grateful for the reconciliation they had desperately needed. They laughed, talked, and Jacob slowly began to shed the heavy sorrow that had clung to him since his father's passing. For the first time in ages, Henry's home was filled with a warm, lively energy, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The next morning, while they sat drinking coffee, the phone rang. The call was from a police officer who had been handling the case. The officer's voice sounded cautious, almost hesitant. "Mr. Henry, we visited your father's house this morning. We found him unresponsive in his office chair, right where he last spoke with you. It appears he passed away from natural causes." The words struck Henry like a weight to the chest, leaving him stunned and speechless. A hollow emptiness settled over him as he absorbed the news. Raymond, the man who had crafted a life defined by fear and pain, was simply gone. The debts he had ruthlessly enforced, the lives he had ruined in his endless quest for power and wealth. It was all over now. No judgment, no remorse, no punishment. Henry felt a surge of anger rise within him, as though life itself had dealt an unfair hand. His father, a man so feared and manipulative who had once bent the world to his will, had simply slipped away peacefully. Meanwhile, so many of those who had crossed his path were left without peace, paying dearly for his greed. Raymond would never spend a day wrestling with guilt or facing the consequences of his actions. He had exited life quietly, leaving behind a trail of devastation and never looking back. Hanging up the phone, Henry sat frozen, grappling with what this meant for him and Jacob. Glancing at the boy, he noticed Jacob's concerned expression. The boy, still so young, couldn't fully grasp the weight of what had happened, but he sensed the heavy silence and the tension on Henry's face. Somehow Jacob knew something profound had just shifted. Letting out a deep, steadying breath, Henry realized that despite the pain and disappointment that had defined his relationship with his father, a part of his life now felt unburdened. He and Jacob were free from the oppressive shadow that Raymond had cast over their lives. Relief, mixed with sadness, washed over him, as if an unseen chain tethering him to the past had finally been broken. He rested a hand on Jacob's shoulder, a small gesture, yet one that carried immense significance. "I think it's time for us to move forward, Jacob," he said quietly, his tone steady. Jacob gave a slight nod, even if he didn't fully grasp the weight of the moment. But there was a spark of trust in his expression. Both of them knew it was time to leave behind the dark legacy Raymond had left and start anew. It was Henry's first step toward living a life free of the burdens of the past. The connection between the two deepened over time, transforming into a bond that was both comforting and profound. Jacob no longer saw Henry as just a guardian. He became the family Jacob thought he had lost forever. To Henry, Jacob represented a second chance, a path to redemption and a fresh beginning. Together, they began exploring new places, leaving the chaos of the city behind for tranquil escapes. Jacob was able to dream freely, free from pain or judgment, and found joy in the little things. With every trip, Henry shared his knowledge, yet more often, it was Jacob's resilience and innocence that became his greatest lessons. One day, Henry made a decision that would change everything. He surprised Jacob with a home he had purchased in a quiet seaside town. Nestled in a friendly community and surrounded by serene landscapes, the house was modest but warm, with all they needed to build a life of peace. "This is our new home, Jacob," Henry said, a smile breaking across his face. Jacob stood silently, taking in the bright walls, the garden blooming around the porch, and the welcoming aura of the house. Finally, he grasped Henry's hand, tears welling in his eyes. "This is everything I've ever dreamed of," Jacob whispered, wrapping his arms tightly around Henry. As the days passed, the community welcomed them with open arms. Henry began offering his financial expertise, not for profit, but to help others navigate debts and build stability. He even started a small community support center, turning his inheritance into a source of good. Meanwhile, Jacob thrived. He returned to school, formed new friendships, and joined city activities, from soccer matches to local festivals. In time, Jacob grew into a confident young man, with a light in his eyes and the wisdom of someone who had faced hardship, yet found the strength to overcome it. Together, he and Henry proved that even from a painful past, a bright future could be built. One serene evening, Henry and Jacob sat together on the front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shades of orange and pink painted the sky, casting a tranquil glow that seemed to settle over everything, as if the world itself had paused for a moment of stillness and connection. Jacob turned to Henry, his chest rising with a deep breath, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Henry," he said, "for everything, for giving me a home, a family, and the chance to start over." Henry's chest tightened with warmth as those heartfelt words sank in, words he never thought he'd hear. Smiling, he rested a hand on Jacob's shoulder and replied, "No, Jacob, I should be thanking you. You've changed my life. You've shown me what truly matters. You've given me purpose." The moment lingered, the silence between them filled not with emptiness, but with an unspoken connection. Together, they reflected on all they had endured, the struggles, the growth, and the comfort they had found in each other. That evening marked a turning point, the past loosening its grip, fading away like the setting sun. Their bond, unspoken but deeply understood, became unshakable. Every sunset and every sunrise on that porch became a symbol of the journey they had shared. The challenges faced, the tears shed, and the triumphs celebrated. Over time, their past struggles transformed into distant memories, not burdens, but lessons that shaped their future. Jacob grew up strong and self-assured, his once painful scars now symbols of resilience. He no longer carried the weight of suffering, but instead bore the story of a life rebuilt. Henry, in turn, found renewed purpose through Jacob. Their bond inspired him to dedicate his resources and efforts to helping others who were struggling, using his experiences to make a difference. The peace he felt was a gift he hadn't expected, but one he cherished deeply. Together they left the pain of the past behind, building a life rich with love, security, and meaning. In every shared laugh and every story told, they celebrated the family they had become. Their journey was a testament to transformation, turning hardship into hope. In the end, Henry and Jacob discovered that even in the darkest times, there is always the possibility of a new beginning, and they proved that with love and determination, the shadows of the past can be replaced with a brighter, more hopeful future. If this film touches your heart, Leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.